African initiation rituals. Night falls on the savannah. Groups of young people gather around bonfires. They are about to undergo a ritual that will determine their future. Drums beat out a hollow rhythm, elders sing, and the air is filled with the smell of burning herbs. This is the night of initiation, a night when pain, blood, and screams become the language of tradition. No one has the right to refuse. There is no choice. To enter adulthood, you must shed blood and test your body and spirit. Such rituals have existed on the continent for centuries. They stretched from the coast of East Africa to the forests of the Congo and the savannas of West Africa. The meaning remained the same. A young man or woman had to undergo a trial that would leave a scar on their body or in their memory. Without this, they were not considered adults and could be rejected by their community and even their own families. Among the Maasai, for example, young men were taken into the forest and circumcised. A knife blade cut through the flesh without any anesthesia, and blood flowed onto the ground as a symbol of connection with their ancestors. The main rule was to remain silent. Anyone who cried out or moved was disgraced before their clan. 19th century ethnographers recorded cases where men died from blood loss or infection, but death was seen as part of the ritual. Many peoples of West Africa emphasized scarification. Young men and women were laid on the ground and cut dozens of times with sharp razors. Blood flowed from the wounds, and ash or herbs were rubbed into them to make the scars brighter. The resulting scars became a passport. They could be used to identify a person's origin, clan, and status. The wounds festered for weeks, leaving huge scars, but this was considered beautiful and proof of endurance. In some communities in Central Africa, rituals for women were accompanied by genital surgery. This was presented as purification and preparation for marriage. Women were held down, while senior priestesses performed the operation with a blade, after which the entire village gathered to celebrate the completion of the ritual. Screams and cries of pain provided the backdrop for songs and dances. Colonial archives have preserved dry descriptions of such ceremonies. British officials in Kenya recorded camps where young men were kept in isolation for weeks, starved, and subjected to endurance tests. French officers in Guinea reported mass female rituals where dozens of girls bled to death while crowds celebrated, dancing around bonfires. These rituals had one thing in common: personal pain did not matter. A person had to die as a teenager and be born as an adult, and the price of this transformation was measured in scars, injuries, and lives. Communities believed that without this, it was impossible to be a complete man or woman. The system was self-perpetuating. Those who went through the bloody rituals became their guardians. Older men and women who had themselves once experienced torture now held and cut young people. And no one called it violence. It was tradition, purity, honor of the clan. By the end of the 19th century, colonial authorities, doctors, and missionaries had documented thousands of such cases. In one region of Sudan alone, hundreds of deaths were recorded each year. But no one dared to intervene. Any pressure was met with resistance and perceived as an attack on culture. So the rituals continued, and the cries of young men and women were drowned out by the drums, just as they had been for centuries before. For the Maasai of East Africa, male initiation has been an act that has determined not only personal status, but also the future of the entire clan for centuries. Young warriors were taken from their villages and isolated, usually in the forest or savanna. There, the ritual began, the main part of which was circumcision. The blade of a knife was plunged into the flesh without anesthesia, blood fell to the ground, and the crowd demanded silence. If the initiate cried out, shame fell not only on him, but also on his family. Such cases were remembered for a long time, and sometimes the clan could lose its influence in the community. Ethnographers of the late 19th century described teenage boys and young men who lost consciousness from blood loss, but tried to hold back their voices until the very end. Deaths were common, but they were seen as a sacrifice to the spirits of the ancestors. The Maasai women's rituals were no less cruel. Girls were prepared for marriage through an operation that was supposed to cleanse them. Older women, accompanied by singing and ritual dances, performed genital mutilation. The procedure took place in public, accompanied by screams and songs, so that the pain itself became part of the collective celebration. Only after this was a girl considered worthy of being a wife and mother. Those who refused risked being ostracized and losing their right to marry. Among the Yoruba people of West Africa, initiation took a different form, but the essence remained the same: suffering in the name of belonging. Scarification was widely practiced here. Dozens of deep cuts were made with razors on the faces and bodies of young men and women. Ash or plants were rubbed into the fresh wounds to make the scars brighter and more pronounced. The resulting patterns became a passport. They could be used to identify a person's family, clan, and even region. Young people bled profusely. Many collapsed from exhaustion, but each new cut was greeted with songs and rejoicing by the community. For the Yoruba, such marks were a symbol of beauty, courage, and submission to tradition. In Central Africa, especially among the peoples of the Congo, initiations turned into lengthy forest schools. Young people were taken away for weeks, sometimes months. There they were kept in harsh isolation, starved, and forced to perform exhausting tasks. Their bodies were covered with scars and sometimes ritual burns. Girls went through so-called schools of femininity, where they were prepared for marriage. But the training included not only learning songs and myths, but also sexual violence by men chosen by the elders. This was presented as an initiation, although in essence it was legalized exploitation. Colonial documents from the late 19th century contain eyewitness accounts. Reports from French officers in Guinea mention mass female ceremonies, where dozens of girls bled to death while crowds danced around them. British missionaries in Kenya recorded the deaths of young men from sepsis after circumcision. Dirty knives and lack of care led to blood poisoning. But all this was considered acceptable. The community said that those who did not survive were not meant to become adults. Everything that happened was presented as a sacred process. Blood had to be shed, pain had to be experienced, otherwise the transition to adulthood was considered incomplete. These practices kept entire peoples within a single system. Each generation repeated what had been done by the previous one. Tradition existed not as a choice, but as an obligation, supported by the fear of being expelled from the community. In each region of Africa, the form of the ritual could differ. For the Maasai, it was a knife and silence. For the Yoruba, blood and scars. For the Congolese peoples, isolation and rape. But the essence remained the same. Suffering was the price for the right to be recognized as a person among one's own. The 20th century was a time when Africa entered the era of colonialism and then independence. It was then that initiation rituals first became the subject not only of ethnographic interest, but also of political conflict. Colonial authorities, missionaries, and doctors openly called them barbaric and demanded that they be banned. But for African societies themselves, outside interference was perceived as an attack on their cultural identity. And the louder the voices of opposition became, the more the rituals became a symbol of resistance. In British Kenya in the 1920s, a conflict erupted that went down in history as the Battle for Circumcision. Christian missionaries demanded that the Kikuyu people abandon female initiation rites, calling them cruel and unacceptable. But to the chiefs and elders, these words seemed like a direct challenge to their culture. As a result, circumcision became a marker. A true Kikuyu was obliged to defend the tradition. Girls who refused to undergo the ritual were called traitors, and their families were pressured. For nationalists during the colonial period, these rituals became the last line of defense against cultural assimilation. The situation was similar in French West Africa. Colonial laws formally prohibited mutilating operations and initiation camps, but in reality, officials turned a blind eye. They understood that any intervention could spark an uprising. Reports from French administrators in the late 1930s noted, "Women continue to undergo ceremonies in remote villages. Our policy is not to interfere, so as not to disrupt the fragile order." This meant that tens of thousands of young women continued to be subjected to bloody procedures, while the colonial authorities preferred not to see what was happening. In South Africa and Lesotho, male initiation rituals, ulwaluko, remained taboo even for discussion. Teenagers were taken to the mountains, where they were subjected to grueling trials and circumcision with dirty instruments. Deaths were recorded annually, but were not openly discussed. Attempts by colonial doctors to intervene were met with aggression. "White people have no right to violate the secrets of our mountains." As a result, dozens of young men died, hundreds were left crippled, and all of this continued to be perceived as a natural part of growing up. After gaining independence in the 1960s, the new African states faced a dilemma. On the one hand, politicians declared modernization and equality. On the other hand, they knew that a direct ban on rituals would provoke mass resistance. Therefore, many governments limited themselves to formal laws that were practically unenforceable. In the villages, everything continued as before. Young men and women were still taken to camps, blades still left bloody marks, and screams were drowned out by drums. Ethnographers working in Africa in the mid-20th century noted that secrecy intensified the cruelty. Whereas rituals had previously been performed in public, after the introduction of laws they became hidden, almost underground. This deprived them of social control and made them even more dangerous. In Sierra Leone, for example, the Bondi women's societies began performing circumcisions at night in huts where it was impossible to provide medical assistance in case of bleeding. In South Africa, camps for men became even more closed, and even local doctors were no longer allowed to enter. By this time, the first African voices of opposition had emerged. Women activists in Kenya and Nigeria began writing articles and pamphlets openly calling the rituals torture. But within their villages, they were ostracized and threatened. In a society where the ritual was equivalent to social belonging, any resistance was perceived as treason. Thus, in the 20th century, initiation rituals found themselves in a paradoxical position. On the one hand, they were officially banned and condemned on the international stage. On the other hand, they continued to exist in reality, fueled by fear and pride. For the outside world, this was proof of backwardness. For the communities themselves, it was a symbol of their cultural independence. In the second half of the 20th century, Africa found itself at the center of international attention. After World War II and decolonization, Western countries and new international organizations began to talk about human rights, and it was against this backdrop that initiation rituals became one of the most painful topics. In the 1970s, the first major reports by the World Health Organization documented the consequences of mutilating practices, chronic infections of the genitourinary system, infertility, complications during childbirth, sepsis, and mortality. The same reports indicated that male initiation camps in South Africa claimed the lives of dozens of young men every year due to blood poisoning, gangrene, and blood loss during circumcision. But for the communities, this was not a reason to abandon the rituals. Elders said that those who died were not worthy of being called men. In the 1980s, African writers and feminists brought the issue into the public arena for the first time. Books and articles were published in Sudan, Kenya, and Nigeria, in which women recounted what they had gone through during initiation. These texts read like testimonies. They held me down. I screamed. The blade was blunt. Blood ran down my legs. But everyone around me was singing and dancing as if it were a celebration. Such confessions were a breakthrough. Until then, the subject had been taboo, not even discussed within families. The international community reacted more and more harshly. In 1990, a conference was held in Nairobi where female circumcision was declared a human rights violation and a form of torture. Several African countries, including Ghana, Senegal, and Uganda, passed laws banning these practices. But on the ground, little changed. In villages, parents continued to take their daughters to midwives and send their sons to mountain camps. The ban made the rituals secret, but it did not stop them. In South Africa, male initiation camps became the subject of heated debate. The deaths of young men were recorded annually, but the camps declared themselves sacred territory where neither doctors nor police were allowed to enter. Attempts at medical intervention were met with aggression. Newspapers wrote about bodies found in the mountains, but the community justified their deaths as natural selection. In West Africa, women's societies such as the Bondo and Sande continued to practice circumcision, even despite bans. The ceremonies became even more secretive. They were held at night, in isolated huts, under the guard of elders. There, initiation schools were set up, where girls were taught songs and myths, but at the same time subjected to violence. By the end of the 20th century, the statistics were horrifying. In Somalia, 98% of women had undergone mutilating operations. In Sudan, the figure was around 90%. In Mali, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, it was over 80%. In South Africa, dozens of young men died every year, and hundreds were disabled after mountain camps. These figures were cited at UN conferences, but they had little impact on practices in villages, where everything was determined not by law but by community opinion. It was during this period that initiation rituals became an arena for ideological confrontation. For international organizations, it was torture and a violation of human rights. For African nationalists, it was the heart of culture, a symbol of independence from the West. This conflict only strengthened the tradition. Whenever it was discussed in Geneva or New York, the villages responded with the words, "You don't understand our soul." Today, in the 21st century, African initiation rituals have not disappeared. They continue to live in villages, mountains and forests, and sometimes in megacities, where they were brought along with migration. International organizations and governments call them crimes, violations of human rights. But in the eyes of the communities, they are still a sacred duty, a right that makes a person a full member of society. And that is why the blood continues to flow. In South Africa, thousands of young men are sent to Ulwaluko camps in the mountains every year. There they are circumcised without medical assistance, using dirty knives and razors. The mortality rate remains high. Dozens die every year from blood loss and blood poisoning, and hundreds are left disabled. In 2022, official statistics recorded more than 70 deaths in a single season. But families continue to send their sons because a man without the ritual is considered less than human. He will not be accepted into councils, he will not be able to marry, and he will be despised. In West Africa, secret societies such as the Bondo in Sierra Leone or the Sande in Liberia still perform mutilating operations to this day. Girls are taken to isolated huts, where older women perform rituals accompanied by songs and dances. Afterwards, celebrations are held, and the operation itself is interpreted as purification. Despite laws providing for prison terms, all this continues because refusal means social death. The girl will be called unclean and will not be able to marry. Kenya and Tanzania are striking examples of this struggle and its paradoxes. On the one hand, there are strict laws against circumcision. On the other hand, hundreds of cases of secret initiations are reported every school holiday. Girls are taken to villages where everything happens just as it did hundreds of years ago. Some operations are performed right in the bushes, on the ground, accompanied by singing and drumming. Doctors note that it is precisely because of the clandestine nature of the practice that mortality and complications have increased. Emigration has made the problem global. In London, Paris, Oslo, and Berlin, there have been cases where girls from migrant families are taken on vacation to Africa and subjected to operations. Sometimes it all happens right in apartments in big cities. Police and doctors find underground clinics where elderly midwives continue to perform rituals for money. For parents, it is a matter of honor and belonging. They fear that without the ritual, their daughter will not be able to marry within her community. The modern media frequently publish stories about deaths in initiation camps. South African newspapers regularly carry reports such as "Body of teenager found in mountains after ritual." In Nigeria and Sierra Leone, mass ceremonies of women's societies are recorded despite bans. But the authorities are afraid to take tough measures. Any intervention is perceived as an attack on culture. The UN and WHO call this a direct violation of human rights. African activists are organizing campaigns, conducting educational programs, and trying to convince parents. But tradition proves stronger. The community keeps everyone in fear. A man who has not undergone initiation is considered effeminate. A woman who refuses the ritual is considered unclean. In a situation where social rejection means poverty and isolation, people agree to torture for the sake of survival. Today, initiation rituals are a reflection of the conflict between culture and human rights. In New York and Geneva, they are considered a crime. In African villages, they are a sacred duty. In London and Paris, they are condemned as barbaric. And in migrant communities, they are seen as a necessary condition for marriage. And so they continue to exist, in blood, in fear, in screams drowned out by drums. These rituals have not died out. They have simply changed form. And as long as collective pressure is stronger than the law, as long as community honor is valued above life, the drums will continue to beat, and the bodies of young people will remain the arena for the most ancient form of violence called tradition.